Mutant Socialists assemble. Mutant Socialists assemble.
Welcome back to Personalist Manifestos. My name is Michael Morelli, and I'm the host of this ongoing conversation about contemplative revolution. The Mutant Socialists are back in this episode, and we're here to dig deeper into how we became bad leftists, David's home, power, and appliance troubles, what it means to be a mutant socialist, and what all this has to do for living in a world on fire right now. In fact, let me read a quote from something David said near the end of our conversation. It struck me like a bolt of lightning when I was editing what you're about to hear. Quote, "We're sort of on a knife's edge. We don't know what's going to happen in Greenland. We don't know what's going to happen in the U.S., whether that country gets torn apart by civil war or other sorts of conflicts. That's happened before. People think of the U.S. and think it could never happen, but everything that can happen has and will happen in the U.S. We go back through American history. These things that seem so extraordinary and impossible to us now are just written on page after page." We recorded this episode on January 29th, 2026. So David's reflections appear to be prophetic. Anything that can happen in the U.S. will happen, including joining forces with Israel to attack Iran. And what will happen next? I ask that question with a fair amount of fear, while also being grateful that there are people like Jeff and David in the world to talk to make me feel less alone and have hope, despite all the dread-inducing things going on in our world, that there actually is something that you and I can do that changes the world around us for the better. So I hope this conversation offers you a similar hope. And with that, here's my conversation with Jeff and David. The mutants are back. How's everybody doing?
Better than David.
Yes, better than David. David, do you want to give us an update on the situation in your household right now?
Well, can I just let me just try to capture it in general, because I don't want to come off as complaining about what is a very privileged life, but everything is broken right now and broken at the same time. And
is that an analogy for our political, social, and economic reality right now, or is that just more like a literal description of where you are in life?
It's both figurative and literal. And it's funny because, people often say, well, it all happens at once. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's true for very, very explicable reasons, right? Like, I mean, if everything breaks at once, that sometimes happens because of randomness, like Poisson clumping, this concept of Poisson clumping, where if you were to take a handful of rice and throw it on the floor, it would scatter, semi-randomly, but also bits of it would clump, right? Just by chance. And sometimes bad things clump just by chance. But sometimes you bought everything at once, and so it sort of breaks all at once. And the appliances in our house are 10 years old, so they've kind of reached that point where they're going to start to go. The house is 10 years old, so you got to recaulk the house. This is very interesting for people who've tuned into this home repair podcast. And it's like having a house with a bunch of windows is brilliant and beautiful, literally brilliant and beautiful. But then you have to pay to caulk them all, and that's very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so it feels like there's a bit of a disintegration happening, but it does parallel the political disintegration. The good news is it's cheaper to fix than the political disintegration.
Yes, just a trip to Home Depot or Rona. Do you all have Rona in Ontario, or is that just like a BC thing?
We do.
Yeah.
We do. There's one down the road, although we just paid a company to come do it.
Or Canadian Tire, because Canada and such. None of those are sponsors of this show. There is no paid advertisements. This is not an advertorial for Home Depot, Rona, or Canadian Tire. Yeah.
But pro tip, you do your caulking, folks. Check your caulking for cracks, for wear, for tear. Invest the money now and save yourself a fortune in the future. Now's the time to do it. Also, fun, I like to throw this tip in every podcast I do. Check your smoke alarms and CO2 detectors. If they're old, they may need replacing. You could save your life, and the life you save could be your own.
I mean, let's be proactive and not reactive. It's better to have them and not need them than need them and not have them.
Mm-hmm. Change is hard, even for batteries, but we need to embrace change.
This episode brought to you by the future of power. Anyway, so David, yeah, you're just your audio only, and your last time we checked, you were 57% on your iPhone battery. Thank you for making this work. And it just seemed to me that this is like the plot to a 90s or early 2000s action film. Like you said Die Hard, but I was thinking about that movie with Ryan Reynolds where he's like buried underground and he's got his BlackBerry, and then there's like a snake that keeps coming into the little coffin that he's in. That's kind of like what's going on here, but much more boring and middle class.
Have I ever seen a Ryan Reynolds movie? I don't know the one. I don't know that one. Oh, I've seen Deadpool. I'm trying to think of Ryan Reynolds movies. He's. I sometimes get him confused with the other one.
Oh,
Right.
Gosling. They must not like that.
and the other one, Captain America. Who plays Captain America? That guy. What's his
That's
name?
a Chris.
Chris.
Yeah, and there's all the Chris's.
A lot of
There's
Chris's.
5 of them.
Yeah. Anyway. So Jeff, I'm going to give you the chair, the mic, so to speak. You were the one who came up with some really thoughtful mutant socialist themes and questions to talk about. And David and I and you are going to just, talk about those questions that you
Sure.
you thought up. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The questions came from this concept of mutant socialism ever since you interviewed David, and he said he's kind of like a mutant socialist. I've been thinking about, am I a socialist or not? What makes me not a socialist? And we offline or by email came up with 100 excellent topics to talk about, far too much for one podcast. And so we said, well, maybe we should have more than one. But there's still the basic question of what is a mutant socialist? Why are we kind of lefty, but not really? And so I thought that was worth exploring and maybe defining, because I thought I was the only one until it turned out I wasn't. So I'm going to start out just by asking you, what do you like about socialism or left-leaningness? What makes you a lefty? Michael, go ahead.
Okay. Wow. All right. I was thinking a lot about this, and there's lots of ways I could answer this question, but it actually reminded me of the first conversation David and I had, and him talking about why he ended up where he has politically, economically. And a lot of that comes from like his just family background. And for me, it's a little bit different than David's story. I mean, every story is different, but for me, like my family is the product of two very different stories. My dad's family immigrated from Southeast Italy when he was 1, and my dad is one of 8 children. The firstborn actually died in Italy due to malnutrition. And I think that and the struggle in South Italy, like after the Second World War, prompted my dad's family to move to Canada. So that's my dad's side of the family, working class Italian East Vancouver family. They ran a restaurant for years and just worked and worked. And so that's that side. My mom's side is very different. It's very white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Calgary oil family, country club types. And so when my parents and also worked very hard, like very hard. My grandpa started a law firm and did contract law, and just worked harder than anybody. Even when he went on sabbatical, like he still put in more hours than all his other colleagues. My mom was telling me that the other day. And my grandma was an artist, but before that, she studied biochemistry and was like top of her class. And so it's just kind of like, I remember David saying, like, with that sort of story, things can break one of two ways. And my version of that was like, I could have probably bought into the free market capitalists, like rich people are rich because they work hard, and poor people are poor because they don't work hard. And if they just worked hard, then they would get the money that they needed, and they would, have the quality of life that all the rich and gifted and hardworking people had. But just like coming from those two very different family backgrounds and having parents that um, just, I think, their jobs. My dad was in public education, mom was a counselor. They really had a sense of equity and justice, and they didn't shield myself and my brothers from the realities that I think a lot of kids like me get shielded from. And so I think that was really integral to like my early, pre-political, self. Um, And so I kind of broke in the way of, you know, okay, well, there's that story that's told by, capitalist, free market capitalist, neoliberal, all that sort of stuff. But when you actually pay attention to sort of like basic human experience, some of those stories that are told don't check out. And so later in life, once I did some more reading and research, it just sort of confirmed that. And then just the last thing I'll add is like, for me as a Christian, um, I'm not going to say that, there's a text, within the Bible like this is this is socialism. But when I, hear something like the Sermon on the Mount, when I read the Beatitudes, I don't know how you get through any of that. Matthew 25, even Old Testament text about caring for the sojourner, right? Leaving 10%, leaving the gleanings when you're harvesting at the edges of your field so people can pick it up, fair wages, you know, equal weights, debt without interest, like Jubilee every 7 years, let's hit reset and cancel debt. Um, I don't know that that can just be like described, straight up as socialism, but I'm like, democratic socialism, personalism, and some of the stuff that I'm really exploring seems to square with that. Like, I just don't think you can get through the Sermon on the Mount with the story being told by free marketeers. So I could say a lot more, but that's my as short as an answer as I can give you on it.
Well, I'm going to jump in on that because same in the last part, at least. Going to seminary definitely made me more of a lefty. It was one of those things that happened to me very gradually because I grew up in interior BC, very conservative area, son of a trucker, very blue collar area. And, everybody's dad works at the mill or something like that. Like it's very much conservative, maybe possibly separatist. Ontario carries the country. Why don't we have our own thing? First guy I ever voted for was conservative. And the only reason I knew who he was is because he wore a great big cowboy hat and challenged someone to a fight in Parliament.
I mean, that's pretty cool, especially for like a kid.
Yeah. Daryl Stenson, if you're wondering.
Oh, yeah. I remember that guy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I thought I was a conservative and growing up in evangelical circles, Baptist Church, Alliance Church, had a strong sense of self coming from conservative Christianity. And the more I got into Christianity, the Christian part of it, the more conservatives started disowning me. I didn't think I wasn't a conservative. I was told I wasn't a conservative.
I'm just trying to follow the guy who was born in a very backwoods town, who was born to working class parents, didn't have his own house, and
Was a
said, "Come follow
refugee
me."
from the
Yeah,
moment he was born.
yeah. Said, "Care about poor people if you're rich or yourself poor." Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was kind of proven to me that I was not a conservative. And I started reading more about the things that I cared about. And when I started seeing those values in political contexts, it was called leftist or socialist or idealist. So yeah, that's how I came to it. How about you, Dave?
Well, we covered a little bit of the background, and that I think is the the socialization part is an important part of it. But you either then coast, or, you either rely on the path dependency of the socialization, or you break from it for some reason. Either you hit a critical juncture and it pushes you in another direction for one reason or another, or you reaffirm it. And I reaffirmed my leftism and grew it over time, um, in half intellectually, and I would think half, maybe we'll say emotionally. And the emotional side is just the visceral sense of seeing someone suffer and think, well, we ought to do something about that suffering, and because it shouldn't exist, especially in a society that is wealthy. And I often say that the contemporary challenge isn't one of scarcity; it's of distribution of abundance. And in a society of abundance, there just simply is no good reason, technical, moral, otherwise, that people should be suffering. We invent reasons as just ex post facto justifications, but they're bullshit. And so I don't want to see anyone suffer, and I think the best way to not see anyone suffer is to have both a generous social safety net, which isn't socialist per se. I mean, in fact, it was invented by a conservative, Bismarck, Germany, in Prussia, but has become synonymous with socialism on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to have power and control belong to the many so that they can decide collectively what they want to do and then collectively ensure that no one suffers. And that dovetails with the intellectual appeal of my iteration of socialism at any rate, um, which is power, the distribution of power. I just distrust the clumping of power, whether it's clumped in the hands of the private market and oligopolists and plutocrats, or for that matter, the state. Which is why I'm not like a classic communist, right? I don't want the state to be overstrong either. In fact, I don't want the state to be in control of too much. It's that my iteration of socialism is a market socialism. It's a socialism that relies on worker-owned enterprises. Uh, there's different models for that, and some state involvement, because there are certain industries I think that only the state can uh, viably run, but that you have this balance of control between workers and the state, and some in the private hands as well. I don't think, for instance, if someone wants to open a bookshop, we don't need a complicated model to run a used bookshop, right? But we do for an insurance company or an auto plant or so on and so forth. And so those are the two paths, I think, you could say, that have led me to my iteration of socialism. Incidentally, it makes you unpopular in some senses with everybody, because everyone's like, you're not really any full one thing. It's complicated, and it's this sort of complex interbalancing. And people are always like, no, but what team are you on? Right? You're like, I'm on team don't starve. I'm on team people make decisions for themselves. And people are like, okay, but what color's your jersey?
100%. So that's one of the things that I'm picking up from all of our stories is that none of us were looking for a label necessarily. We started with a value. We started with a reaction to something we saw in our context and said, I've noticed that I want to take a compassionate response here, or that I want to empower people or center people in this, or I've recognized the way that power is distributed in my community. Like, these are all things that are traditionally elements of socialism, but we weren't looking for socialism necessarily. We kind of leaned left more organically than that, I think. Does that resonate with you guys?
I hasten to add that I'm not a joiner. Um, I don't I don't like joining things typically. You know how some people have FOMO, fear of missing out. I have phobia, which is fear of being included. Like, I don't want to be included in things. Typically, I don't want to be invited to things. I don't. I like to, this notwithstanding, this obviously I like doing things like this, but I like being by myself and being left out. At home with the dog and a book is good for me. But uh, which is in some senses contrasts with the idea of a socialism that's highly organized and based on meetings and based on all of these things. But this speaks to the fact that it's a value-driven thing. Is that whatever your values and might be, whatever your preferences might be, I do think most of us probably meet at the point of thinking that we don't like other people suffering. And even, full-on capitalists will often, who aren't being caricatured in Severance or something, will often say to you, well, of course I don't want people to starve. I don't want people to suffer. I don't want people to struggle to make ends meet. But if they don't, that's not on me. And this is where, whether you like being included or not, you have your, pardon the pun, come to Jesus moment, right? Is okay, well, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to then say, well, it's not really on me, New Testament, never heard of her, or do you think, well, there's now a conflict between what I think is important and the values I ostensibly espouse, and what happens in the real world when we live together, and how do I reconcile that? And I can reconcile not like going to meetings with being a socialist, but I don't think you can fully reconcile this idea that you don't like to see people suffer, and yet if they do, it's their own fault, because that's demonstrably untrue at scale, right? It might be true for some people, but if you think of, and this speaks to a point that Michael raised at the top, and when telling his story, if you think of life as a kind of race, and you say, well, everybody runs the race, okay, that might be true, but some people run the, say, 800 meters and they start at 700 meters run. Other people start and they happen to be naturally good runners, and other people start not being able to run at all. You can't call that a fair race. It's just, because of chance and circumstance, it's fundamentally um, asymmetrical, if not to say unfair. So I always like to remind people of that. It's like, it's just not a fair race from day one. But to go back to something that Michael said a moment ago, is then, okay, well, if you're able to then become good at running that race, as I think we have in different ways, despite where you come from, what do you then say? Do you turn around and say, well, my God, why doesn't everybody run like I do? Or do you say, I was one of the lucky ones? Oh, and a hard worker too, but luck is always part of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Michael, you, being a church guy, are a bit of a joiner, or at least have been at times. I've been a joiner a couple of times as well. Why did you not join the socialist club, so to speak? You're not wearing any party colors right now. Why is that?
Oh, it's a complicated question, I think. I think by virtue of the fact that I am a part of a church, and not just any church, I am a part of a North American evangelical church, and I am also part of a North American evangelical Bible college and seminary. And so, for those reasons, despite the commitments that I've sort of sketched out, that would be a no-go for a lot of people within, the team that, at least on some points and values, there would be similarity, but then on others, whether they were actually different or just perceived as different, I would probably be disqualified or prevented from full membership. And I've not had anybody actually disqualify me. I don't know if that's because people are just super welcoming and willing to hold some of those things in tension, or I'm just such small potatoes that nobody has noticed and nobody cares. I think it's probably more the latter, because um, there's of course caricatures of all parties and right? Their lack of acceptance and whatever. But it seems to me that people who do lean more to the left politically, and even people who are more progressive theologically, are much more welcoming to me. And it's not like people who are more right-leaning politically or theologically or philosophically are mean to me. They just don't invite me to anything. No, it's it, and I say that in earnest, and I get that. Like whether it's because they don't know about me, or like because they know about me and they're like, that's not our cup of tea. Either way, and if I did show up, I'd probably get in more trouble and be less welcome there. I know myself enough.
Yeah.
So I also do like relate a lot to what David said. Like, I'm extroverted when people see me, but the way I recharge is like a book and just time at home with my family and chilling. And I actually think that I'm okay with what I just laid out, because I think there's something to be said for liminal figures, people who maybe have some commonalities with a party or parties, but haven't fully joined the team. I don't think it all comes down to critique, but I think there's a role of understanding, but also a little bit of distance, so that there's a critical realism there. And I one of the figures that I find so fascinating in this regard would be somebody like James Baldwin. Like the role that he played within his context, to me, seemed a lot like that. I mean, you knew where he stood, you knew where he would be most welcome, but I never got the sense from his writing or his speaking that he was fully bought in. He occupied this kind of liminal space that I would actually call prophetic.
Mhm.
And I think I am drawn towards people like that. I think Ellul was that, right? I mean, he was one of the first professors in France to teach Marx, but he was highly critical of left-leaning folks.
Mhm.
Not because he didn't have things in common with them, but he just felt like we should extend the same level of critique to ourselves that we should to our so-called opponents. And if we're not willing to do that, like, not only is that intellectually an issue, but it's actually dangerous in terms of how we're living.
Yeah.
So there's that Groucho Marx quote, whatever it is, I'm against it. That is one of my, words to live by. Like, if it's super popular, I'm probably against it.
Just reflexively. No, I think you raise a really good point. I mean, try and think of any of your intellectual heroes who were a party man. Like, it's difficult for me to think of. I can think of a handful of even Canadian politicians who have actually inspired me with some intellectual or inspirational values based speech or something like that. I mean, everybody's talking about the Carney speech lately as being the most consequential political speech from a Canadian in decades or something like that. I think that that's largely true, but I think that that's really sad, and it's an indication of the state of party politics. Because in times that were less polarizing or less polarized, there were more speeches on that level. There were more ideas that were able to flow, that were able to be drawn in. But to the point of you guys maybe not being joiners for a lot of reasons, Michael, I feel the pressures that you feel, and that's why I have, despite spending 10 years studying the Bible and theology, have never gone into ministry, because that I didn't feel like I could please a church board and be authentically myself or follow Christ in the way that I thought was appropriate at the same time.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons that I got into politics in the first place, was because I was trying to live out and embody a Christian ethic in a way that demonstrably improved the world around me. And I felt like there wasn't much of a vehicle within the church to do that. And so I looked for inspiration and vision in politics. But to your point about not being necessarily welcomed by people, that's been my experience of the left. From when I worked in a factory when we first moved to Ontario, and I had my coworkers coming after me on the factory floor because I didn't attend a union meeting because I had missed one or something like that, and badly quoting Marx at me as they tried to ream me out. Or even bad experiences in unions where I see the union makes a deal that like disenfranchises their younger members or things like that. To actually being involved in federal and provincial politics. I ran twice federally, once provincially, all with Green parties. And anytime the Green Party starts to do okay, the NDP comes after us. And that was very predictable and sometimes very shockingly vicious. And it's like we are the two parties that should get along really well. There's a lot of overlap there, but then there's also a lot of insecurity there in a first past the post system, right? So I understand it, but it still really sucks to have people that you largely align with ideologically really attacking you for being too similar to them. Like what's up with that? So even now looking around at people who are democratic socialist or otherwise left leaning who are doing well, they're doing well or not based on the vision that they can cast. People keep looking to Mamdani in New York. And he's someone who doesn't talk about socialism. He talks about the vision of his city that he wants to see. Meanwhile, I'm looking at the NDP leadership race, and I'm seeing a lot of realpolitik where they're discussing, how to get the ground game going, how to win elections. Should we pivot to the center to draw in more people, or should we hold firm on our convictions? I'm like, but what are those actual convictions? I know what all of your shibboleths are. I know which ones I haven't passed because you've told me very clearly on Twitter or wherever else. But what are you for? So that's been my experience with the left. Is it much like the conservatives told me I was not a real conservative? The leftists told me I wasn't a real leftist. And I'm happy being one of those liminal people, and I think that's a better place to be. But I would love to see some vision from the left that could actually inspire people to show up and vote rather than, trying to strategize how we can maximize our messaging in a campaign that has no vision.
I'll just say that as you're talking, I think there's an analogy that I hadn't thought of before, but it occurs to me that the same problem that besets Baptists, and I am at a Baptist school and go to a Baptist church, is almost like the same problem that besets the left, which is like you split over everything. Minutia. When I think there are certain things that should lead to split, or you know what, this isn't a good idea. But I think in both contexts, it's just too quick to say this is what it is. And when, to me, I observe the right, one of the things that I think explains, to me at least, I'd be interested to see if either or both of you agree or disagree on this, is once the primary is picked, there's like loyalty.
Mhm.
Even if that primary is like so rude
Yeah.
up until that point, like, like the Republicans are just like, it doesn't matter what they say to each other. Once one of them picks, like, a lot of them fall in line, and then eventually you get to a point where it's like they start to devour each other, but there's like just this kind of like willingness to work together that you don't necessarily see in the groups that ostensibly are about working together.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Dave, jump in on this, but it makes me think immediately of Jonathan Haidt.
Oh, Righteous Mind?
But Dave's our resident political psychologist.
Yes.
I mean, so I think the bucket that catches all of these drips is that we're talking about organizations. At least that's, I think, the core unit we're talking about, and it makes me think of Conquest's third law of politics. Uh, I'm reading some of the McCarran books that I haven't got to yet, the Slough House books, and I got to one, and it opens with, and it's about these rejects from MI5 in the UK called Slough House, and it's a television series. I mean, everybody probably knows this, but the books are perfect. And it opens with this Conquest third law of politics, which is the simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it's controlled by a secret cabal of its enemies. And it's so perfect because when you look at political parties, you think they must be run by their enemies, right? I was a practicing Catholic into my 20s, late-ish 20s, and I remember thinking, this place has got to be run by its enemies, right? Like, surely it's got to be run by its enemies, because how else do you explain a church that preaches the gospel and then hides sex criminals, right? And God knows what else. And the answer ends up being much more mundane than any great conspiracy or anything like that. So it's just, organizations are complicated things that have, among other things, a tendency to produce these psychological connections that serve to perpetuate the organization above all else. And then that puts aside values and so on and so forth, because the goal of the organization is to continue to exist first and foremost, which produces some, let's be charitable and say, incongruous outcomes. And then there's petty grievances. And then there's little fiefdoms, and that starts to explain more and more. But by the time you get to like values, they're kind of tertiary at best. And it's always, well, the ends justify the means, of course, right? We'll get to the values, but we have to deal with all this other stuff first. And then layer onto all of this that psychological connection of in groups and out groups, where okay, the in group may be imperfect, but it's better than the other guys, the out group. And so we get special dispensation because, again, the ends justifies the means. And you get all kinds of just terrible outcomes, gatekeeping, protecting, incompetence, awful actions that are then justified by, again, the ends justifying the means, all kinds of skullduggery and what have you. And that happens in the church, well, various churches, I should say, different faith traditions and their organizations. It happens in politics. It happens at the office. It happens everywhere. It's just a fundamentally human organizational thing. The difference is with politics and things like the churches, at some level, we've been conditioned to expect better, or at least, in some sense at first. And they were always disappointed in that. And then it comes back, I was thinking when Jeff was talking about this challenge that you have of at one point just having to make a decision of, do I stay and try to make it better? Or do I leave? Whether I leave as a liminal figure or something else and try to do my own thing and whatever. Am I better, within the organization trying to do my small thing to improve it? Or do I go? And for me, the decision has always been I go, because I'll lose my mind, for one, if I stay. It's part of the reason I left the Catholic Church. And it's part of the reason I left. I was a liberal into my, early 20s. It's part of the reason I left the liberals. I couldn't abide it anymore. In part because of the group dynamics and psychologies, and in part because I just, in some sense, held on to those higher values and expectations, which you might call kind of jejune or whatever. But they were really, really important to me. And in the years since, I think I've only become more cynical, though. And that's the real challenge, is fighting the cynicism that almost invariably emerges from trying to square these circles, because you get really, really run down and really cynical at some point. And I think that's very, very dangerous, because that's when you just check out altogether. And then, of course, the worst people stay and thrive. And that's how you kind of end up with what we have now.
I think you've hit a really important point there, David, because you talked about a lot of the challenges that you're talking about are systemic challenges, and then a lot of them are just the outcomes of having, frail, tired, dysregulated humans within those dysfunctional systems. Cynicism is one response. Tribalism is another response. These are ways of us dealing with things not working the way that they're supposed to work, and they're shorthands to help us get through it, to help simplify things to a point that we can deal with it. And sometimes I wonder if maybe the solution to this is that we need, well, first of all, we need to go an entire generation without some kind of mass trauma, so that we're not always coming from behind. But secondly, I think we need a society with a little less busyness, a little bit more leisure, a little bit more time to actually think and be healthy and touch grass, as we keep saying. But the other part is your point about just leaving. We were talking about the church earlier. Earlier today, I was talking with my wife Andrea about how in churches, this is what happens: is that people just leave and they just start another church. If we can't do it the way that we want to do it here, well, now I'm a church planter. And I've had that temptation so many times, because I used to say, even when I was still in Bible college, I would say, well, if I'm going to pastor a church, it either has to be a very special church that I don't know exists, that isn't going to throw me out, or it's got to be one I plant myself. And I have resisted the urge to be that cynical. And I don't want to plant a church out of cynicism with the existing churches as its base. That would be a terrible church. But then thinking about that politically as well, sometimes I wonder, because in 2015, liberals were asking me to run for them in the riding I was in. And instead, I started a Green Party riding association from scratch and ran Green, because I didn't feel like I would be able to influence anything from within the Liberal Party. And for that reason, I paid close attention to Nate Erskine-Smith, who also first ran in 2015, and he's about my age. And I've often thought, like, oh, if I had gone Liberal, could I have been like Nate? And has Nate actually been able to make a difference? Because he's been a backbencher who is often looked to as the black sheep in the Liberal Party, sometimes the conscience of the Liberal Party. He's advocating for a lot of policies that I care a lot about, like basic income and electoral reform and things like that. And has he actually made a difference in his party? I think he's asking himself that question, because he ran for leader of the Ontario Liberals last year, or year before. So maybe he's looking for a way out too, because he wasn't able to make a difference in that system. So, whether or not to leave is a valid question. I've also asked many times, what would happen if every Green quit and joined the Liberals and tried to actually influence it from the inside? Would that be a more viable solution to actually implement any of the vision and change we want to bring? I don't know. But at its core, we're limited by the systems we're in and by our own capacities to actually be resilient and proactive within those systems. What do you think of that, Michael?
Yeah, I see a lot of what you're saying, and I wrestle with the dynamics in real time. And I think this is why I found a lot of fruitful questions, ideas, and themes in personalism, because just repositioning the actual human person that you're in proximity to within your consideration of any, big, medium, or small question. And what that does is say there is this massification of everything, this over-determining of things like expediency and power, and how much are we willing to give up of our values in order to affect change at a large scale. I don't think that there's like a one size fits all answer, but usually once you get to the level of like, mass society, the means start getting more and more compromising. And the ends start to get more and more compromised because of the means we use. I mean, this is Elul's refrain from first book to last, right? Bad means corrupt good ends. And everybody thinks they're the exception to the rule. But stronger-willed people than me couldn't resist, right? The corruption of the means. And so for me, there's this tension of being realistic about where you are and figuring out what will cause you to leave. Like, what are your absolutely nots, and then what are things that you're like, you actually, it creates moral distress, but you can live with it enough because the individuals and smaller groups of people that you have a positive effect on are worth staying in spite of that moral distress. And then what do you do personally in order to like actually deal with that moral distress? And one of the things that I've found, at least where I'm at, is generating trust with people, which takes time, that I work with, and discerning when to share and when not to, where I'm really at on my own terms. And what I've found is the more I start to share, the more I'm pleasantly surprised that there are a lot of people who feel something similar to what I'm feeling or think similar to what I'm thinking. They're just afraid to say it. And just being willing to get asked to leave because you choose integrity over a promotion or influence or power. And I think that's why a lot of things just don't change, is it actually costs people something to do the right thing. If it didn't cost people stuff, there wouldn't be these cover-ups in various institutions. And we're seeing it all over, right? Like, religious institutions, political institutions, cultural institutions, right? And so people benefit from not saying something or doing the right thing. And so I've just kind of flipped it and said, like, well, when do I leave? Okay, there's a few things that I'm like, this is when I leave. But until then, it's like, keep trying to choose the right means and the right ends to the best of your ability, prioritize like the reality of the person, and just make peace with the fact that that might get people asking you to leave, but make them take responsibility for that. Don't run if you don't absolutely have to. But it's not going to be clear cut, and you just have to live with the reality that people won't understand you, write you off, call you bad things, or within the Christian world, you don't believe in the authority of Scripture, or you're going to hell, or you're woke, and all that sort of stuff. So just, and it's funny because Jesus is like, blessed are you when people say those mean things about you. You're like, how is that blessed? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm still figuring out what it means to be blessed if that happens to you. But like, that's just actually part of the deal, which is probably why I'm in the academy and not the church. That's the last thing I'll say. I'm with you, Jeff. I asked Stanley Hauerwas once if he ever thought about being in ministry, and his answer was no. And I'm like, why? And he's like, because I'm a shit. I was like, oh.
That's exactly what Dave said when I asked him why he wasn't in politics.
Yeah, because you dissent. You dissent too much. And that's why I, after my brief stint in the local church, I realized that my inclination to dissent would not lend itself to career longevity. Hey folks, I want to jump in quickly before we get back to the show. There are a few ways that you can help out Personalist Manifestos if you've been engaging with this show for a while. First is that you can just tell people about Personalist Manifestos, online and offline. Like and repost our posts. Add to your recommended reading, listening, watching lists. Leave reviews and rate us. Pray for us if you're the praying type. Suggest people to interview, topics to cover, work to feature, and that sort of thing. And you can support financially with either a monthly subscription, a yearly gift, or a one-time donation through Substack. And hear me when I say this, every little bit helps. I did the math, and if everybody who's currently following us on Substack just gave $1 a month, that would be enough for this show to break even. And that really is the financial goal. I don't want to make money, but I also don't want to lose money. And right now, a good amount of what goes into this show is out of pocket. So if you could help us out in any way, that would be awesome. Okay, back to the show.
Well, I think you've really hit on that, Michael. One of the tensions that I've been feeling in all of this is that personalism and really being real about the person seems to, in some ways, create a dichotomy between our personalist perspective and politics being very much a group activity. And I wonder if it's possible to bring realist sensibilities to politics as that group activity. And maybe David can explore that a little bit.
Oof. Oof.
Can I give a really short answer while
Please do.
David
Yeah.
ponders? I want to say that Reinhold Niebuhr thought the answer was yes. And to a certain extent, I agree with Reinhold Niebuhr. But Reinhold Niebuhr's critical realism always risked sliding into nihilism.
Mm.
And one of the clips that captures this super well, I show this to students when I talk about Niebuhr. You know, Barack Obama said that Reinhold Niebuhr was the most influential theologian in his life. And I show them that clip when Barack Obama talks about the findings on the torture that happened, and how he, ran promising that he would hold people accountable for the torture that happened as a part of this global war on terror. And so, he becomes president and does this press conference, and it's the famous, we tortured some folks, but now's not the time to get sanctimonious. These were patriots, hardworking people who were stressed, and now's not the time to think about the past. Now's the time to move forward. And I was like, that is where critical realism, right, can actually slide into the nihilistic, like, we tortured some folks. What are you going to do? So that's what just popped into my mind is yes, critical realism, but it is very difficult to maintain, especially when you have a lot of power.
Yeah, well, and I do even want to say that I think that even does a disservice to nihilism. I think that's just being shitty.
Yeah. Nietzsche, he's like, I don't want that. That's not me. That's not what I'm about.
It reminds me of a Ricky Gervais bit about Nietzsche that I don't think is fit to be repeated here, but people can look it up. It's genuinely quite.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
Funny, yeah.
Yeah.
It's where Nietzsche meets Hitler in hell, and so I think I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been thinking. I was in a. Let me get at this obliquely. I was, as people love it when you do that. I was at a bookstore in Ottawa recently, and a used bookstore, and I was just browsing around. And because I'm writing this book, or ostensibly writing this book about nationalism, I'm paying a lot of attention to how people talk right now. And these guys were talking, and I sort of listened, not in a creepy way. They were having a very loud conversation in the middle of the bookstore. They're guys that work there, as they were moving books back and forth, and they were just sort of shooting the shit. And someone brought up the fact of the potential for conscription, and said if you were conscripted into the Canadian Forces or the Civil Defense Corps or whatever it would be that we'd have, would you fight? And the guy said, well, it depends. If it's the Americans, yeah, because I'm just aching to spill Yankee blood. Whoa. And he said it in, I think, earnest. And then they sort of talked about how they were drinking Tim Hortons rather than other things, and I didn't have the heart to tell them. But
just for those who are not aware, Tim Hortons is owned by an American company.
Yeah, Brazilian and there's Yankee. There's some Canadian money in it too, but it's
Yes.
like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
it's
like
not.
classic conglomerate.
Yeah, it's not what you think.
It's like
It's not the
McDonald's buying Chipotle.
exactly. It's not the good hometown, you know. It's like the Maple Leafs being owned by an American hedge fund. It's the equivalent of that. Not they aren't, but I'm saying that would be the equivalent of that.
Yeah.
Um,
They probably are, though. I'm a Canucks fan. I have to say that.
I'm trying to think. Well, yeah, the good news is the Leafs are self-defeating, and so you don't really even
So are the
have to come up
Canucks.
with anything.
Yeah.
That's true. But then it got me thinking about what you would do in extraordinary times and what you wouldn't do. And invariably, of course, you think back to the 1930s in Germany, and a lot of people thought they could bargain with what was happening, or they could somehow control it or do better within, at least for a period of time. And a lot of the people were just cowards, and they went along to get along, you know, just following orders, or they ran. And sometimes you run because the alternative is to do nothing and to die. But there are people who could have had a role in stopping it and plainly didn't. And now we're facing the Americans in Canada, and it's all elbows up and so on and so forth. But you know what? We're building vehicles for ice. We want to build Coast Guard vessels. We want to invest in the American capital markets. Last summer, we had 2 or 3 of the biggest months in our history buying into the American capital markets because, you know, why do people rob banks? That's where they keep the money, right? And then we think, okay, well, what would people do? What do people truly believe in and value at the end of the day when you have to reveal your preferences because you have to forego something? And then you realize there's a lot of people who would be complicit in some really nasty stuff right up to the end, justifying it all along that, well, if I just go along, you know, I gotta survive. Maybe I can do better if I'm in a better position. Maybe I can bargain with this. It's like that. It's that Lord of the Rings meme, you know. Uh, and you start to think at some point that maybe this isn't completely genuine, right? Maybe these people really just they dress it up as realism, but it is just cowardice or just plain self-interest or hiding nefarious beliefs and trying to wash them through the lens of critical realism. Like maybe you're just a sadist, right? Or a Nazi or whatever it might be. And I use that word very hesitantly, but we've got to start talking about brown shirts. And so I get very nervous with critical realism, not because I don't think it's plausible in scenarios, just because I think that it's often deployed as a smokescreen.
Yep.
And so, but it's not even theoretical anymore. It is very much live ammo exercise now, right? Because we're dealing with this and we don't know what's going to happen, right? Like we're sort of on a knife's edge. We don't know what's going to happen in Greenland. We don't know what's going to happen in the United States, whether that country gets torn apart by civil war or other sorts of conflicts. It's happened before. Like people think of the United States and think it could never happen, but everything that can happen has and will happen in the United States, right? If you go back through American history, these things that seem so extraordinary and impossible to us now are just written on page after page of the American story going back to its founding, right? So, these are all things that may seem theoretical and in some senses are, but now are also very real, clear and present. And so it's a time to think very deeply about it, but also to start thinking about red lines. And I think with organizations and other things, it comes down to red lines: is where are your red lines? Where do you draw a line and say here, no further? And what do you think the probability is that you're going to stand on those lines versus talk yourself out of it when push comes to shove? And you don't know until the moment, right? You really don't know until you have to decide.
Well, and that's why it's good to think about it in advance. And I love to see that people are thinking about these things and exploring them. What you were talking about, David, really made me think of a show that my wife's been watching on Netflix called The New Look, which is about the big designers of haute couture in Paris when the Nazis come in. Was Coco Chanel really a Nazi, or were they just offering her a deal that was too good to pass up? Those dealing with these tensions of what does it mean for Christian Dior to continue to make dresses, even though they're all going to be worn by Nazi wives. But he's still got to make money, and his sister's in the resistance, and he's funneling that money back to her. So, who was the good, patriotic person, and who was the turncoat? Those kinds of questions are not easy to answer, but having a red line for yourself and understanding about it in advance, I think, is really critical. But I think what you've both been talking about, especially as you get down to what is my personal red line, really is, it tells me that whether or not you're involved in politics as a group exercise or a team sport, I hate when the people call politics a team sport. It is not a game. It is people's lives. And when we treat it like a sport, we treat people's lives as if they are frivolous. But when you can be involved in the group activity of politics and still understand that you yourself need to have red lines, that you yourself need to have some sense of yourself that goes beyond your group tribal identity. And so I think in that sense, personalism can be the antidote to the kind of insanity that we're seeing in our politics today.
Even the analytical tool that anarchism offers you, David Graeber talks about this, right? It's just even taking the distrust of authority and power as a sort of heuristic for any of these questions, I think is really helpful. And the personalist piece too is something that I think is really important, right? My red line is dehumanization and violence, right? The question of violence. And this is where a lot of people differ, right? It just kind of, for a lot of people, it goes without saying that violence is justified in X, Y, and Z situations. But, for me, as a Christian, I'm like, the story, the key part of the story is the crucifixion of somebody who was declared an enemy of a state and an enemy of the religious institution at the time. And so, that's the guy we supposedly follow. That's the guy we supposedly worship. And he said from the cross, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And he said it's finished. And if you believe like I do, that he rose from the dead, like, where does that put you on the question of violence and dehumanization? Right? Read Romans. What's the stuff before the stuff about, serving the state? Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. If your enemy is hungry, give him something to eat. If your enemy is thirsty, give him something to drink. Right? Love your enemy. Really? Yes. And that's kind of my red line, is like structural violence, but also personal violence. And that is a red line for me politically, socially, culturally, and religiously, and in my job, right? It's just like, once people are being harmed, and it's usually the vulnerable people that nobody really cares about. And it's just like, can more people get on board? Like, you don't have to frame that theologically, but can we just get less excited about spilling blood? Like, let's actually get excited about the possibility that that things other than violence might solve some of the problems, very real, complicated problems that we're dealing with right now. But like David said, you don't know until the moment comes, and this is why I don't think situational ethics helps. Because as much as I have this sort of philosophical and practical commitment to nonviolence, you can't envision what's coming. And that's why I say, always ask yourself what kind of person you are becoming, right? This is the value of virtue ethics. I don't think virtue ethics is the only answer, but it's about, how do you prepare for the moment that you can't even dream up on your best day?
I want to go on the record as saying I do think virtue ethics is the is the only thing that can save us and the only thing that we need.
I actually think you're right socially. I think Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue is, I think, a place to locate some of the hope that I have, because as much as our language has become so impoverished and nobody can agree on anything anymore, when you say a word within the language of virtues, we all kind of have a working sense and can kind of agree upon, like if you say wisdom or trustworthiness or kindness, there's enough there. It's not totally barren of meaning that we can actually start there. So I'm with you, David, socially.
I think that.
Politically.
I
Go ahead.
the reason I'm so particular is we can rationalize anything, and the distinction between rationalization and intellectual justification isn't as obvious as you might think, right? And again, this goes back to, I think, the inconsistencies and the tensions we've been talking about. Is if you go back to just war theory, is that, okay, how do you understand when a war is okay, when it's permissible? And there were lots of people who've been thinking about this for a very long time. One of them was Saint Augustine, like one of the great hallowed saints of Catholicism, and the one I was most interested when I was when I was a Catholic. It just, he is one of the main figures in the tradition of just war theory. It's like, well, how can you justify, especially as a Christian, a war? And then in classic kind of like, Catholic fashion, it's like, well, if the authority says it's okay,
Yeah.
you
And,
then it's fine.
cry while you're killing the enemy,
Yeah,
which is just
exactly.
like psychologically, phenomenologically impossible. Like,
It was just the same guy who says, what is it? Oh Lord, make me chase, but not yet, or whatever it was, right? Like, so, but I just say that by way of saying that with virtue ethics, I think you really, as my friend says, it sort of distills it into the question of, okay, what kind of person you want to be?
yeah,
In a way that cuts through all of that justification, rationalization, whatever, and it says, okay, fine, but what kind of person do you want to be? Now, but to your point, I think, Michael, that joining the resistance and picking Yankees off from 500 yards from the bridge to Windsor is one thing, maybe, but we could talk about that. If someone had broken into your house and was threatening your family, then what? Do you bash someone over the head? To me, just viscerally, I think the answer is yes.
Mhm.
And but then sit with that and say, okay, well, what is that? What work through what that means about you as a person and how you feel about that. And is it something that, like, be honest with yourself? Is it something that you're going to sit with traumatically for the rest of your life because you've done violence against someone? Or is it something that you want to do or like to doing? Because there are sadists who want to do this and like doing this. Like, you can feel among the population a certain subset of person who would relish conflict for the sake of conflict. They're a kind of person. That's not the kind of person I am. I find violence to be abhorrent, and I'm very, very uncomfortable with it. And yet, I'm trying to work through the circumstances under which you would act. I read this book by Patrick Bishop called Paris 44 about the French resistance in Paris in the late days of the Second World War and what they did to try to preserve themselves, their families, and their city during Nazi occupation. So you can ask yourself, what would you do? You could feed people, you could hide people, you could relay information. Some of them picked up rifles and picked off, Nazis in the streets to try to undermine the dehumanizing things the Nazis were doing. I mean, these are all things that I think you can try to work through intellectually, but at some level, you also have to work through viscerally.
Mhm.
And I think the embodied emotional aspect of these things is also very, very important. You mentioned the phenomenology of these things earlier, and I think we forget that often too, especially when we're trying to rationalize things, how important that kind of visceral, emotional understanding of ourselves is, because it's very easy to lose that, but it will find you again. You cannot, it is the thing you cannot hide from because it follows you. And sitting with that, I think is also very, very important in reacting to those feelings as they come up.
I love what I'm hearing from you, Dave. And I think the thing that stands out to me the most is just that you're doing the work of thinking about and feeling through those questions. And I think that if we have an ethical or moral system that we ascribe to, or if we have an ethic that is based on just like party tribalism, and everything's okay as long as it's our guy that's doing it, what you're doing is just not doing the work of deciding what kind of person do I want to be, or what kind of world do I want to live in. And I think as long as someone's asking those questions, um, they are probably going to have a much more nuanced perspective than any sort of tribal identity will allow for, and they're going to come up with better answers.
But then nobody invites you anywhere.
That's right. We're bummers at parties.
Yeah, I just figured out like when to like shut it down, and I've got my little like like binder of things that I'm interested in, but are like not going to be a downer that I know that other people are more likely to want to talk about, and so then I'll bring those out.
Yeah.
And then other times I'm just like, do we have to go? Because it's the small talk that kills me.
Yeah.
And I get it. I'm too much for some people.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
I will say that I think that doing that kind of ethical thinking and work is very much a personalist approach, rather than just accepting a label or a package of ideas that comes with more of a tribal identity. And I will say that now, having been a federal and provincial politician, I do not feel like I can't continue at those levels, because I feel like I can't be respectful of my own personhood in those conditions. And I've watched people that I respect really succumb to those conditions. These people, people that even that I ran against, who, um, if you can get them alone and far enough away from a microphone that they're willing to be themselves for a few moments, you can find that the person is still in there somewhere.
Hmm.
But at a municipal level, I don't feel that at all. In fact, the things that have made me successful as a municipal politician have been the things that I am most passionate about, the things that I am maybe uniquely bringing to my council. And I don't know if that is purely a factor of not being involved in a party system that has top-down authority. I think that's a big part of it. I think another big part of it is just how hyper-local my action is. At most, I'm operating at a county level. And the only way that I operate at a county level as a lower tier municipal politician is by connecting with my colleagues in neighboring municipalities within the county. So, all of it is relationship driven. All of it is very hyper local, very rooted, the kind of touch grass politics that we keep talking about. And that has allowed me to take the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years of education and political action, of determining what my ethics are and what kind of person I want to be, and connecting and engaging with my community to bring out all of those nuances and things that don't really fly in a soundbite in a hyper partisan environment. It all possible and more effective, because it's that unique personalist approach. And so my advice to everybody, if you feel like the world doesn't make sense and you're being forced to pick a side, and you're stressed about things that are happening in other countries and outside of your control, and you don't feel like having a vote really equates to having a say in your country and all of those other things, get local, because you being yourself is absolutely critical to the functioning of our society. And when I hear Michael talking about the ways that he is political in ways that maybe he shouldn't join a party for, because there might be pushback against that, all of those things you talked about were highly personalist, but they were still very intensely political, because there's politics in terms of party politics, which is the team sport or group exercise. But being yourself is maybe the most political thing that you can do.
Yeah, that's and anybody can tell me when I become guilty of what David was describing, right? Like we can come up with so many justifications or rationalizations for why we continue to do what we do, but that's actually a lot of like that goes a long way in describing why I stay within the context that I do. Because I look around and it's like, should I be doing more? Should I be doing more? Like, where's my activism? Where's my advocacy? Where's my, am I being enough of an ally? And it's like every time I I go into the classroom and talk about these sorts of things, um, that's that's my advocacy. That's my activism. That's my being an ally. And some people will be like, well, that's not enough. Okay, not for you, but like, what that leads to constantly surprises me. And I suspect that it'll continually surprise me in terms of just right down to the books you do and don't assign. Like, I will be so diligent about finding the right book because the right book changed my life when that prof assigned it, right? And if that prof assigned a great book and they cared about me, like that radicalizes a person in the best way possible, not a bad way, like ideology and, creating versions of yourself, but helping them discover they're not alone. Somebody else sees that it's wrong. Someone else is trying to fix it. Here's a word for that experience you had. You didn't know that word existed, but now you do. It speaks so deeply to your soul, right? I believe that actually something as just small as that actually changes stuff. And so it's just a way of me echoing from my own very small context what you're saying. Don't believe the lie that it's only important people and powerful people and wealthy people and famous people and flashy people that change things. It's just look at the people that changed your life. Really think about it. How many of those are those people? Not actually a lot, right?
It could be you. I've been telling people everywhere I go lately, if you have love in your heart, run for something. Because we need people who have love. When people think about like all the qualifications they want politicians to have, I have one qualification at this point. Having been in the system for almost an entire term now, one thing you need to be a good counselor, you need to have love in your heart.
Oh, come on. Come on.
I mean, it helps if
Yes.
you can think through an issue or things like that. But ultimately, a political system is set up so that literally anyone can do it. Nobody who is currently in parliament is smarter or better than you. And the only qualification that most of them have is being in the right party at the right time. And so the thing that I want to urge people towards is if you have love in your heart, they're not better than you. You might be better than them because a lot of them don't have love in their heart. A lot of them only have room for social or tribal identity in their heart. And they will take the party line over the people of their riding or just the principles and who they want to be over and over again, because that's how systems work. And I'm not demonizing those people, but I'm recognizing that you need to have a genuine connection with human beings and a desire and a red line of prioritizing them over success, prioritizing people over that concept of winning that so many people are so obsessed with right now. Winning is humanizing people at virtually any cost in my mind. And so if you have that perspective, please run for something, because otherwise all of the incentives in our politics will draw in the toxic people and keep out the loving people. So be a loving person and participate, please.
David, any comments?
Well, I can confirm that indeed people in Parliament are not smarter than anyone else. Spent a lot of time with a lot of them. Some of them are very smart and very nice and very decent, but you And the whole idea, incidentally, just to bring it around to back to the traditions of democracies that we again ostensibly hold dear, is that the whole idea of the House of Commons is that it did represent, the commoner, a certain iteration of the commoner, but certainly wasn't meant to be, you know, the House of Lords. It wasn't meant to be the royal executive. It was very much meant to be a space for normal people, more or less, so normal people. And we've lost that to some extent, and to a significant extent. And politics then becomes a profession rather than an avocation, rather than something that anyone can do, quote unquote. It becomes a sort of professional thing, and it ends up cheapening it in a lot of ways and leads to a lot of negative outcomes. So, but I agree with Jeff. I mean, I think you still have to know how to navigate spaces, and there are certainly limits to what you can and can't do with love, but at the very least, you need an absence of malice. And I worry that far from being in the privileged position of being able to be in spaces full of people with love, we're entering spaces where people are full of malice, not even loveless. I mean, we can kind of work with loveless if we have to, but they're just utterly full of malice.
Mm.
And it it dovetails with to maybe bring this full circle with the self-justifying rationalizations that we talked about, with the organizational imperatives and psychological dispositions we talked about, but also to broader problems socially of induced struggle, lack of resources being distributed, people who feel like the system's not fair to them because it's genuinely not fair to them, who are struggling to make ends meet, who are worried about losing their job to AI or cost cutting, because you got to pay more dividends or whatever. And then these folks are become easy pickings for those with malice in their heart, and they become very easy to radicalize and mobilize. And then you get broader destabilization, violence, social decay, and so on and so forth. And so I'm really quite worried about the moment, because we're in such a dangerous place at the both domestically and internationally, where the sort of international order is crumbling, extremists are rising, and people domestically are just in such precarious spots that they could end up going to some pretty nasty places. And we know what that looks like. And I think if I'm going to leave with people with any thought, it's that when you're thinking about these things and you're working through things, one thing to keep in mind is that, this might seem extraordinary and even impossible. How could you be living through this? But lots of people throughout history have asked themselves that same question because they were living through it, right? If you take the 10,000-foot view of this, nothing about this is particularly novel. It's novel to us because of the context of the last several decades in which we've lived, but it's not historically all that novel, which isn't to mean that isn't scary, but it just means that you've got to accept that it's real or potentially real, and then prepare yourself to act and respond accordingly, whatever that might be. It's not a time to be asleep at the switch.
Amen.
Yeah.
Any other last thoughts on that, Michael? Or shall I pass the chair back to you?
No, I think that's a good place to end. I mean, I always have thoughts. When do I not have thoughts? But I'm trying. In my effort to become a wiser person, I'm just really working on those proverbs about listening more than speaking. So yeah, nothing more to say here, other than thank you for your time, and I appreciate your perspective. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and the action movie ended well. David, you didn't run out of battery. You didn't get bitten by a cobra, but you don't have power still.
But we have people power.
People power. and a small smartphone battery power.
So there we have it,
And,
folks.
yeah.
Do you understand mutant socialism now? Or do we need to do this again sometime?
I mean, I like talking to both of you, so I would definitely do it again just because it's fun talking to you. But maybe, I mean, if you're up for it, if people want the Mutant Socialist to talk about something specific, they can tell us.
That's right. Bring it on, folks.
Or we'll just ask Jeff what other thoughtful things has he written down for us to talk about, and I'm sure that will lead to fruitful conversation too.
I would love that. Then I don't have to start my own podcast.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Mutant Socialists assemble. Mutant Socialists assemble.